I'm Alex Pollock, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conference on a tale of two debt crises. Is Puerto Rico America's Greece? As many of you have told us, it seems our timing for the conference was pretty good. And I need hardly remind you that current events, headlines, and debates make us quite timely. We have the prospect for twin defaults, as a line from the Washington Post this morning, of course, closing Greek banks, weekend runs on ATMs, new kinds of photos of a bank run standing in front of the ATM, the governor of Puerto Rico publicly saying the government's debts are not payable and speaking of a debt moratorium. Lots of debates about possible bankruptcy for Puerto Rican government entities or a financial control board to be imposed, of a new depreciated currency for Greece, or as my friend Desmond has called it, rather than Grexit, an exodus for Greece from the euro, further credit downgrades, and all enough to keep us busy thinking about this. There is some entertainment and comic relief as part of this, since rating agencies and officials have announced that a default by Greece on debt to governments would not be a default. At least it wouldn't be called a default. And we have the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury urging Europeans to find an agreement. I'm sure they really appreciated those helpful urgings. Now, then there is the sober truth, which is that troubled borrowers can keep paying as long as the lenders keep making new loans, and the new loans go to pay the interest on the old ones, even though net nothing is changing except the debt is getting bigger. But when the lenders stop lending more, it's the end of the extend and pretend game. In my view, both Greece and Puerto Rico are fine examples of debt-financed, government-centric, non-competitive economies, which in Margaret Thatcher's wonderful phrase, have now run out of other people's money. Let me share a quotation with you all. The history of Greek borrowing is to live constantly beyond its resources. This begins. It continues, the debt burden was plainly beyond Greek capacity, but for a long time they found new debt to furnish funds to pay the interest on the old debts. However, this aid came to an end. The Greek government then declared that pending further negotiations, it would pay only 30% of the interest on its debt. For 4 years, the creditors' committees and the Greek government engaged in stubborn negotiation without issue. Finally, on the initiative of the German government, provisions were written into agreements whereby Greece entrusted to an international financial commission the duty of controlling the revenues set aside for debt service. However, Greek opinion was profoundly hostile to this arrangement. The subsequent record of Greek borrowing, says this author, is a repetition of the earlier history. This was all written by Herbert Weiss in 1930, describing events in the 1890s, but of course they're remarkably appropriate for June 30th, 2015. Both Greece and Puerto Rico, in their government accounts, have shown a notable ability to accumulate debt. There are too many numbers on this slide, I know, but if you get a chance to look at it on the website, it shows the biggest 10 U.S. states by debt, including such notables as Illinois, and compares it to Puerto Rico, and then converts this to per capita product and per capita debt. And we find that the average of the 10 biggest state borrowers have 21% state and municipal debt to gross product, whereas Puerto Rico has 69%, a remarkable 3 times the debt burden of Illinois. Now, when I showed these numbers to our colleague John Mousseau, he said, oh yeah, but the Puerto Ricans don't have to pay federal income taxes, so they can pay more. to service their municipal debt. Nonetheless, there is a huge level of government debt in Puerto Rico. As of today, something the Greek and Puerto Rican governments have in common are Standard & Poor's, and we have Standard & Poor's on the panel, so I'm using their ratings. They share ratings of CCC minus with a negative outlook for the government of Greece, and CCC minus with a negative outlook for the Puerto Rican government. Of course, there's only, when you have a negative outlook, there's one step down is default of various kinds. And it is important always to remember that although people talk loosely about the debt of Greece and the debt of Puerto Rico, in all cases of this kind, we're talking about the debt of the government. It's the government's debt that is at issue. And in these cases, it all boils down, ladies and gentlemen, to Pollock's law of finance, which is loans which cannot be paid will not be paid. So the debate, therefore, is really about how to divide the inevitable losses among the parties. And for governments in particular, it's about how to obscure the losses which are being taken and to keep the public confused about what's going on for as long as possible. Now, our expert panelists are going to enlighten us further about the past, present, and perhaps the future of these two broke big-time government borrowers. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First will be Dave Hitchcock, who is a senior director at Standard & Poor's and has served as primary analyst for major states and for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. He's been with Standard & Poor's for 35 years, which means, Dave, you've seen a lot of debt crises in that time, as have I. Dave is past chairman of the Municipal Analyst Group of New York, has served on the board of the National Federation of Municipal Analysts and the Comptroller General's Advisory Council on Government Auditing Standards, and received the First Team All-Star Award for Credit Analysis of States in 2014. Next will be John Mousseau, who has over 30 years investment management experience and is Executive Vice President, Director of Fixed Income and Portfolio Manager for Municipal Bond Investments at Cumberland Advisors. He's a member of the National Federation of Municipal Analysts, the New York Society of Security Analysts, and his writing has appeared in the Bond Buyer and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, among others, and he was last with us on this panel to discuss the bankruptcy then looming of the city of Detroit, and we welcome him back to discuss some more, let us say, interesting issues. Our third panelist is my colleague and the co-organizer of this conference, Desmond Lockman, who specializes in the global macroeconomy, exchange rate policy, the U.S. housing market, and multilateral institutions, previously managing director at Salomon Smith Barney and deputy director in the International Monetary Fund. Desmond has written extensively on the global economic crisis, the dollar, the strains in the euro area, and on the Greek debt crisis in particular, about which he has been an unrelenting and correct pessimist. Next will be Bert Ely, who has been a consultant and prominent commentator on banking issues since establishing his own consulting practice 40 years ago. Bert especially analyzes conditions in the banking sector, and we have asked him today to include his views of the banking systems of Greece and Puerto Rico in his remarks. Bert has often testified before congressional committees and is interviewed by the media on a regular basis, and he often attends conferences at AEI and is a prominent questioner of the panel, but today he'll have to answer your questions. Our final panelist will be Whitney Devabois. It's hard for me, Whitney, not to say that the French way, who is a senior partner at Arnold & Porter, which he rejoined in 2010, having served as U.S. Executive Director of the World Bank from 2007. Whitney's experience includes Brady Plan restructurings at the end of the 1980s global debt crisis and debt restructurings of Belize, Greece, and Argentina, numerous privatizations. We should have some of those coming along out of these debt problems. as well as Eurobond financings. He's written extensively on securities regulation, debt restructuring, international banking, and sovereign immunity. We're delighted to have this truly knowledgeable and outstanding panel with us today. Now, each of our panelists are going to speak from 12 to 15 minutes. After that, we'll give them a chance to react to each other or to clarify points that they have made. After that, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 11 o'clock. Dave, you have the floor, and thanks for being with us.
Great. Is that the PowerPoint? So, as it turns out, when you talk on Puerto Rico and Greece, you have to be very quick on your feet. I supplied new slides yesterday afternoon to the panel here, updating Greece. But I could not at that point update the slides for Puerto Rico. So already one of the slides is out of date, having passed about 12 hours. So let me start. I just want to make a disclaimer. I'm a Puerto Rico analyst, so I'm not the in-depth expert on Greece. I'd be happy to connect you with our Greece team, but I am passing on the comments from our sovereign ratings group. I've been asked to talk about similarities between Puerto Rico and Greece and differences. And so, well, the first thing is that we look at different criteria. So I just want to have a disclaimer here. We're not using exactly the same criteria. So when I point to some metrics, it's not necessarily weighted the same or even evaluated the same from one to the other. One's a territory of the U.S., the other is a sovereign nation. However, we also have additional criteria in our CCC category, which reflects short-term factors and short-term liquidity, and they both come in under that. And indeed, the CCC minus prominently reflects the time frame that we're looking at over 6 months for potential restructuring. And I'll also point to some other longer-term trends. So this is still accurate because our criteria doesn't change. You can see within the CCC criteria, we have different gradations with a plus or a minus or without either. And so the CCC plus, which we had, although it was on CreditWatch negative until yesterday, basically reflects that we don't have a clear path identified for a debt default or restructuring. A CCC minus, on the other hand, indicates that we feel that it's essentially going to happen within the next 6 months. For CCC plus, we're looking over 12 months or longer for a potential restructuring, maybe not a specific path. The CCC, we see a likely default within 12 months to 6 months, particularly with some of the governor's comments in Puerto Rico yesterday. We believe that there will be some sort of restructuring within the next 6 months that's nearly inevitable. So I guess I can slip pretty quickly through this slide with a CCC plus, and instead I will actually read a little bit, a couple of the bullet points from our release that actually came out this morning. So basically, we feel that a default, distressed exchange, or redemption of the Commonwealth's debt is inevitable in the next 6 months, absent something unanticipated. We believe that the report that came out yesterday, or was released yesterday, that was commissioned by Puerto Rico, people refer to it as the Kruger report, but it actually does have a formal title, as the embrace of that by the administration in Puerto Rico indicates, in our view, that they will pursue some sort of debt restructuring. The governor said something to that effect last night in his address to the Commonwealth on television. And so it is our understanding that Puerto Rico has adequate money to pay its debt today and on July 1st, and that it intends to do so, and that we are not aware of a particular default that's being planned. However, we do believe that they will pursue a restructuring of some sort shortly. In fact, under current projections, we believe that they'll have to. Typically, Puerto Rico has needed to sell about 1.2 billion of external cash flow notes within the fiscal year, which ends June 30th. They typically get most of their revenue towards the end of the year, particularly when the income tax comes in, and they need cash flow financing in the fall. So while they might pursue various measures to boost their liquidity in the short run, and bills have been introduced to tap the retirement funds or the state insurance funds for liquidity purposes, they might sell trans, for example, to the GDB for liquidity. We believe that even those will be relatively temporary, and in our opinion, come this fall or perhaps earlier, they'll have a very severe liquidity problem, which is within our 6-month time frame. So that's Puerto Rico. This slide, which I updated yesterday, is still accurate. And it's got some pretty small type. But basically, we feel that Greece is going to, for political reasons, prioritize payments other than to debt holders, and that it's relatively inevitable that there'll be a restructuring in the short run. At one point, Greece was rated lower than Puerto Rico, but we feel with a 6-month time frame encompasses both ratings at this point. So let me talk a little bit about Puerto Rico's pressure points. So first, liquidity. They really need the market access, as I just talked about, particularly in the fall, to carry them through the fiscal year. Without that, they'll have some severe issues on liquidity. And then there's some longer run issues. And in the background, I'll get to at the end, is the economy, but both Greece and Puerto Rico share a declining economic trend, which brings these issues to the fore. But we should all bear in mind that these short-term issues are the result of a long-term trend, which is underpinned primarily by economic weakness. In particular, the pension systems for Puerto Rico are at risk. They've been underfunding them for years. They can't really afford to fully fund them on an actuarial basis. I've seen some commentators point out the fact that essentially on an actuarial basis, they have no assets in their main employees' retirement fund, and they expect the payments to boost. That's not quite true because they sold some pension bonds a few years ago, and they can use the cash for that. So they can actually pay on a cash flow basis pensioners with negative actuarial assets, which is what we would expect in the short run. But that can only last so long. We do expect that when that's exhausted, it'll go to a pay-as-you-go system, and they'll have to substantially boost their payments into the retirement system if they're to fully pay promised benefits to pensioners. The healthcare system has very large projected deficits in the next few years, and that's driving actually some of the biggest part of the out-year gaps that were projected in the report that came out on Monday, but we've been aware of that for some time. And some of that is that they're front-loading some of the payments they got from the federal government under the ACA, and they'll exhaust those in the short run. When we start getting into fiscal 2018, out years, we see very large gaps that start to approach the size of the revenues that they're projecting. So that would appear unsustainable. The debt service does increase, perhaps not as rapidly as these other things I'm pointing to in the out years. There's increasing general fund debt service, and before they get to the general fund, a lot of the press reports I see don't take into account when they look at the fund. Behind that, there's actually COFINA, which is the sales tax financing corporation, which takes money off the top before it gets to the general fund. They have a lot of debt. That goes up about 3 to 4% a year. And then, although they have lowered operating deficits, they're still having ongoing operating deficits. They're projecting this year, in the last disclosure statement, about 191 million of operating deficits for fiscal 2015, even though the 2015 budget was balanced on paper. We feel that there's operating implementation risks. Even if a 2016 balanced budget is enacted on paper, we feel there's still implementation risks. I can go into some of the details of that if the panel discussion gets into it. But there's a number of reasons and certain things they did in fiscal 2015 that made the deficit a little bit worse. And then, as I alluded to before, underlying all this is the economic performance. It's been stagnant. Basically, the last couple of years, there hasn't been really much decline, but there hasn't been much growth. There's been small decline on a real GDP basis. Before that, there was some bigger declines after some federal tax breaks, fully phased out in 2006. But the operating deficits in their budget actually started around 2000. So this predates some of that. And that's partly because some of the federal tax breaks actually started to phase out before 2006. And maybe I should just clarify this. So the federal tax breaks were federal tax breaks for manufacturers from the mainland that located on Puerto Rico. Those primarily pharmaceutical manufacturers are very high value wage industries. So to the extent that those decline, even though there's a small amount of employment, it has a big impact on the gross domestic product. So here's some quick points in comparison with Greece. So first of all, Puerto Rico is a territory within the U.S. government. They have a non-voting representative in the U.S. House of Representatives, but they can't even vote in the U.S. Congress. Greece is a full member of the Euro area. Puerto Ricans have labor mobility within the U.S. There's been an exodus, actually, they call it a brain drain, out of Puerto Rico to come to America for employment. There is labor mobility for Greece within the EU. In terms of currency, Puerto Rico doesn't have control of its own currency. They use the US dollar. Whether Greece has control or not, at least they have some representation at the bank. But we feel that the Greek economy isn't very well synchronized with Europe as a whole. Fiscal transfers is a big point of difference. About 25% of personal income in Puerto Rico comes from fiscal transfers from the U.S. government. The biggest fiscal transfer is Social Security, but there's also Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, veterans benefits, many things in there. And so that provides some support. And furthermore, if you think about it, within the U.S. federal system, U.S. citizens don't really care if New Jersey pays more than Alabama into the federal government. There's not a huge groundswell of opposition necessarily for making payments, these transfer payments into Puerto Rico. Greece, on the other hand, gets very limited fiscal transfers, some custom transfers from Europe. Okay, in terms of economic growth or decline, Puerto Rico has had some periods of decline, but they're not nearly as much. Greece, from 2010 to 14, probably had double the decline of Puerto Rico. In terms of debt, it's really hard to look at. We look at debt ratios generally when we look at states, not including underlying municipalities, electric systems, enterprise systems, unless they've been supported by the State General Fund. And so some of the numbers that we saw in that earlier slide, I might take issue with, actually. So you can look at it different ways. To make it comparable with Greece, it would be a little tough. If you look at the overall electric system, everything in it, it's about 69% of GDP. If you look at it similar to what we look at states, in our view, it'd be closer to about 40%. But for Greece, well, this is just the end of 14. I have net debt about 172%. It's over 180% now. Incomes in Puerto Rico a lot higher than in Greece, but still low by U.S. standards. And then lastly, we look at the impact of a default. Why there might be more debt in Greece. You could say that it's government held and maybe there's less impact on the debt markets as a whole, whereas Puerto Rico debt is privately held. Now hedge funds own a major share and might be less willing to give, per se, in their negotiations with Puerto Rico. They're going to have to negotiate if there is a restructuring. And so perhaps there could be a greater impact on the U.S. market. And so I think my time just ran out, and I'll pass the baton.
Thank you very much. John.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning. My role at Cumberland in terms of managing bond portfolios is really driven by, two things: returns on investments, of course, and preservation of capital. So when I view things in Puerto Rico and tangentially, I guess, at Greece, since it has impacts across, all bond interest rates, as we saw yesterday, I'm doing it from the perspective of risk-reward capital preservation. And if you go back basically a year and 3/4 ago to the end of August of 2013, this Barron's cover really started the run on Puerto Rico debt and the uplift of yields that we've seen since. It isn't that the problems weren't known before that. They were. Most of the bond market knew that. What you had was, and Dave mentioned it at the end of his piece there, was that you had in the tax-exempt bond market here in the U.S., broad participation by retail investors in Puerto Rico debt because of the double exemption from it, free from not only from federal taxes, but state taxes in all 50 states. So not only did you have direct retail ownership, you had large retail ownership across the many number of municipal bond funds that owned Puerto Rico debt. When the Barron's article hit, immediately you started to see sell-offs in the Puerto Rico bond market, and it lasted right through the following January and March, January and February, and it's kept going since. So you started to see selling of bond funds into a market that lost liquidity, and we're going to look at some of the bond yields here in a second. But this was the match that lit the fire. We're looking at COFINA debt here. This is the sales tax debt, and you can see it's jumped up even higher than this yield now. We're going to see some charts I threw in. One of the great things about, as Alex mentioned at the beginning of this, is coming on board on this day when both Puerto Rico and Greece hit the fan over the weekend. You take the deck of cards and all the presentations, throw them up in the air, and see what you got left. COFINA debt traded at very low levels for many years, and even after the first Barron's piece hit. And the reason for that was that the COFINA debt was always seen as being able to...
John, excuse me, is that the green line? That's the yield on
that's
the COFINA debt is the green line.
Is the green line,
just
right.
to help the audience out.
Yes, is the green line. And you can see the timelines on it. As you go into January of last year, it jumped. And then, of course, this May and June has jumped. And if this were updated, you would see it even higher, up in the 14% level. The fear is that, and we quite think this is probably going to happen, is that Puerto Rico is going to try to essentially grab the sales tax revenue and claw it back to the Commonwealth, whereas bondholders have always expected that they get first claim on the sales tax. We'll see whether this happens, but there's certainly the fear factor now that protection that you had as a bondholder with a lien on the sales tax is going to be attacked. Here's the GO debt, and it's really important to look at the comparison here. And in our view, where we have exposure to Puerto Rico is only in insured Puerto Rico debt, and that is by the two of the insurers, Assured Guaranteed and MBIA, and that's all we own. And we actually own it specifically there and started doing it for some selected clients in March of 2014. So this was after yields had risen. The interesting part is that as the news got worse in Puerto Rico through the fall, you can see that all three, both insureds as well as the uninsured debt rose. So one is the actual line for AAA securities. That's the gray line. The blue line is the insured Puerto Rico bonds, and the green line is the uninsured. So over the first 4 months, everything goes up in a vacuum. And then you see the market start to discern the difference between an insured bond and an uninsured bond. And there they diverge. So you can see the insured yields, which we started getting involved in at that 6.5% to 7% level, have worked their way all the way down to about 5%. And they jumped a little bit yesterday to where you saw a few pieces yield around 6%, but there weren't enough trades to really hang your hat on. But it's interesting how the market starts to dissect things. By the way, not that it has anything to do with today's discussion, if you looked at a pattern of Chicago's GO debt, insured versus uninsured, it exhibits the same pattern that you see in the middle of this graph, and they're all going up in an upward yield draft right now, and we fully expect that to be sorted out. One of the things that we look at with the insurers, and the reason that we're involved there, is that we believe the insurers have plenty of capacity to pay any Puerto Rico claims. And remember, the bond insurer's obligation is to pay principal and interest when due. So the fact is, you may have a bond in 2035 where there's a possibility of default or non-payment. The present value of that is much lower, and they would pay debt service. As we saw in Detroit, the bond insurers originally were being offered 15 or 20 cents on the dollar. They ended up settling for 80 cents on the dollar. They have lots of clout in terms of trying to get restructurings done, and we believe this is going to be ongoing in Puerto Rico also. Sales tax, this is just to show you the senior versus subordinate. The subordinate debt really got clobbered yesterday because obviously if they think there's going to be clawbacks, that will be the first to get hurt. The Electric Authority, Dave mentioned possibilities of restructuring. This is PREPA. Again, insured versus uninsured. The gap is hugely wide. We fully expect to see some restructurings in the Electric Authority, in the Highway Authority. The market's estimation is that 70 cents on the dollar will be the new par. That hasn't started yet. To my knowledge, the July 1st payments are in the bank and can be made. So tomorrow, everybody should be getting paid. The governor goes on TV and says, we cannot pay our debts. There's a big difference between saying we cannot pay our debts or we don't want to pay our debts. Because one of the real issues there, and this is going to be the crux of not only the insurers, but also some of the hedge funds that got involved. And you saw a hedge fund involvement come around last spring. Most of the hedge funds have signed a non-disclosure agreement with Puerto Rico so that they can get access to data and basically have bargaining chips in return for loaning them more money. That non-disclosure agreement means that they more or less have information that we don't have, and it means that they cannot trade with anybody else other than themselves. I'm not sure that's helping them right now because they've actually wanted to go to Puerto Rico and say, we will lend you more money if you do A, B, and C. Puerto Rico wants none of that, and that includes reducing payroll, cutting benefits, et cetera. And they don't want to do that. And remember, Puerto Rico doesn't have access to Chapter 9 bankruptcy. They would like to fast track this in Congress to allow that, either directly grant them access to Chapter 9 or fast track them to statehood, and then they would be eligible for Chapter 9, and that's not happening. But the interesting part of it is that even if they had Chapter 9, they'd be required to show that they have taken steps and all the steps necessary to try to pay their debt. And they wouldn't even be close there. So this still has a long way to play out. Little bit here on the crisis. Government debt equals to more than 93% of gross product. Weak internal liquidity, economic weakness, shrinking manufacturing, declining population. David touched on these. Large unfunded pension liabilities relative to revenues. So the story's not good. Here is a reason why we like the Puerto Rico insured debt. And what we do here is we compare Guam, which has a higher underlying rating than Puerto Rico, but not much, but it's a U.S. territory. And we have Puerto Rico insured. And they are trading, on this graph, 200 basis points apart. That would be probably, if you saw some insureds trades, it would probably be closer to 250 today after yesterday. When you look at the insurance agreement in both bonds, it reads exactly the same. So why is one trading 2% cheaper than the other? And the answer is simple. It's headline risk. And the market discounts headline risk by giving you higher yields. And this is true in this case. And what we think is that eventually things come together. Most of this is because you don't have the retail participation. Right now, you would see any of the major brokerage firms, investors could go in and buy Guam insured paper. As soon as everything hit after the Barron's article, and not too many more months, most of the major brokerage firms suddenly then threw down the barn door and said, oh, we're not going to let our clients buy any more Puerto Rico paper. This is, of course, after yields had already risen 200, 300, 400 basis points or more. So after the horse left the barn, then they said you can't buy any more. And that's one of the reasons here. We actually think that Puerto Rico was very close to getting this petroleum tax deal done. And if they had gotten that done, you would have seen the insurers probably take a piece of that because of the way the tax would be dedicated. If the brokerage firms like the Morgan Stanleys and the Merrills of the world had actually gotten involved in that deal, it would be very hard to tell their clients that they can't buy the insured Puerto Rico deal when they're underwriting it. So our thought is that when retail is allowed to buy the insured Puerto Rico, you'll see them come back to the market and these yields will decline. Right here kind of gives you an idea of Puerto Rico geo debt versus its population. You could look at this and put Detroit up there last year, and it would have been a very similar looking graph. And, clearly one of the things that they need to do is, have cutbacks on the budget level. We haven't seen that yet. This is the Puerto Rico bellwether bond. And they issued these a year ago, March. They came 8s of 2035 at a discount at 93 cents on the dollar to yield 8.75. And you can see the price of the bond has declined, and it has really declined in the last few days. And whereas it had been trading at 76 cents on the dollar as of a week ago, the bid side's now down to about 64 cents on the dollar, 65 cents on the dollar, and it's yielding well over 12%. The real question now is, we know the Electric and Highway Authority will most likely have to restructure. The question is the Commonwealth going to have to restructure? One of the keys, when they brought this deal together, $3.5 billion in March of 2014, all you heard from the government was the GO pledge of Puerto Rico is sacrosanct, and we are going to continue to make good on payments, and we'll keep you updated on progress on reforms. You haven't seen any of that. And the problem with that, of course, is the fact the lack of communications is reflected in the dollar price of this bond. Personally, and I'm not speaking for the firm here, I find it very hard to imagine the United States letting a U.S. territory go under. When you think about it, because it's not like Detroit, where it reports in the state of Michigan. Here you have Puerto Rico reporting into the United States. If I'm a holder of U.S. debt, China, and I own billions and billions of dollars of treasuries, agencies, federal mortgages. I'm going to wonder, if you're letting a U.S. territory go under, what's next? Is it Fannie? Is it Freddie Mac? Is it Federal Farm Credit Bureau, Sallie Mae? So, I mean, I think the United States needs to get involved a little more here. Quickly run through this. Some of the other yields on debt you can see have skyrocketed. This will sort itself out over the next few days, but it is clearly gotten very wide. Credit ratings. Yep, thanks, Alex. Credit ratings, Dave touched on this, have been clobbered. With the cuts yesterday, I mean, the next stop will be a default. And I just thought I'd bring this up to take a little quick, since we're talking about Greece as well. You can see this is that now Greece and Puerto Rico are basically trading at multi-digit yields. The interesting part is the yield curves themselves. Here you have a very flat yield curve, but it's actually negative, which tells you that in the beginning years, people are wanting bigger yields than they want out in the far years, which tells you that the markets, even though it's a huge discount, are expecting a solution to this down the road, as opposed to a default which never stops. Because when you restructure, eventually you start paying your loans again. This is Puerto Rico's spring of last year versus now. You can see the huge uptick in yields. In Greece now versus fall of 14. Again, just a few months ago, Greek paper was trading at 6%, and in a heartbeat, it was back at 11. So markets adjust quickly, both up and down. I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Desmond.
Thank you very much, Alex, for arranging this. And what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the Greek and the Puerto Rican situation. And I thought that I might start just with a quote from that great Russian economist Leo Tolstoy, who said, "All happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And I think here what we've got is we've got two unhappy, dysfunctional economies that are unhappy in their own way. So just some of the similarities, both, I think if you look at the debt numbers, you have to, and the GDP outlooks, you've got to come to the conclusion that both have unsustainable debt levels, and they're both in a currency union, but they might have got there in a different way, and I'll get into that in a moment. Both are in economic down spirals, but there's a difference between the Greek and the Puerto Rican down spiral. The Puerto Rican down spiral looks more like it's a secular problem with structural issues really driving it down, too high labor costs or too high electricity prices or not really competitive markets, whereas the Greek case was a situation of a cyclical move because they try to do too much budget adjustment within a fixed exchange rate system, and they learned that if you do that, what tends to happen is the economy collapses. Of course, neither of the two economies, Greek or Puerto Rico, have bankruptcy provisions. I think that this is going to be a lot more serious in the case of Puerto Rico, considering the difference in the structure of the debt that I'll get to in a moment. And then, of course, there's the question of the systemic fallout, that in the case of Greece, the systemic fallout could be a lot more serious because what a Greek event could do in time, it could spread contagion to other troubled countries in the European periphery, like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, most notably Italy, and then we could really have a systemic problem. I don't think that that's the case in Puerto Rico, that if you get a problem in Puerto Rico, it's going to be upsetting for the municipal bond market, but I don't think it goes much beyond that. Of course, the trouble is, and that looks like where we're headed, is that we're going to get a Greek event and a Puerto Rican event in close proximity, so it might not be easy to sort the two out. Let me talk now about, just briefly, about the unsustainable debt position, that if we just look at the numbers, Greece, it's really kind of quite alarming that Greece's debt to GDP ratio has gone from around about 100% to 180. And I might just remind people that that is after a massive write-down in the privately owned debt, that there was a 75% net present value write-down of about $150, $200 billion of Greek debt in 2012. So it really is quite an achievement to get a debt to GDP level that high. Puerto Rico's debt to GNP, which is the better metric for that, as mentioned before, it's gone up close to 100%. What really strikes me is how this progressively goes up, that this really is suggestive of something that is not sustainable. It can't keep rising like that. It's got to mean that you've got the deficits in the government, deficits in corporations, coupled with very low growth, keeps pushing the debt ratio up, and that is a party that really has to come to an end. Now, there are similar underlying causes to the two problems, but then, of course, the differences. Greece was a case of budget profligacy that was made possible by very low interest rates. When they joined the euro, interest rates converged to European levels. German and French banks fell over themselves to lend to the Greeks. Well, there was no budget discipline. Greece manages to run up a budget deficit of around about 15% of GDP by 2010. And, that comes to a crashing end. Puerto Rico, the situation is a little different. That I think what has facilitated this has been the fact that you've got tax-free status on the bonds. That makes it really very attractive. And the markets, in their wisdom, go financing an unsustainable position until it ends. What is really impacting both debt levels is the fact that the economies are already declining in a big-time way. And the case of Greece is really impressive. If you just take a look at this chart, what this chart's doing is it's comparing the trajectory of Greece's GDP since the crisis began around about 2009 to what happened in the United States during the Great Depression. You can see that by this time in the Great Depression in the United States, we were already in an upturn, a significant upturn. Greece, we're really down to where we were at the low point in the Great Depression. And given the events that are going on in Greece right now, I don't think you've got to be a PhD economist to know that the economy is taking another body blow, and that really that decline is going to continue going forward. And obviously that makes it difficult in terms of getting the debt dynamics stable. If we look now, which I think that this chart is rather enlightening, is this compares Puerto Rico to Greece, and we're looking at it, from round about 2005. That's where they start. Greece is the blue line. Puerto Rico doesn't look too good here. That Puerto Rico is down over a 10-year period. We're talking about something like a 15% contraction in GDP. That doesn't make good for the way in which you're going to be able to repay your debt. So obviously they've got to put their GDP on quite a different trajectory. Now, what is occurring in Puerto Rico, which really has to be disconcerting, in terms of whether or not Puerto Rico is going to turn around, whether you can revive it. The Greek economy, if they get out of the euro, they have more flexibility in policies, they can pump the economy up to some degree. Well, Puerto Rico's having a problem is that everybody's leaving Puerto Rico. I understand that right now there are more Puerto Ricans in mainland United States than on the island, and they keep leaving, at the rate of something like 48,000 a year. And who is leaving are the 25 to 44-year-olds, and who is staying are the elderly people. Not that I've got anything against old people, but the young people need to support the old people. So this, from a demographic point of view, looks somewhat of a disaster. And that might be of concern, to the United States. Let me talk about the challenges to both economies, because I think that is really very important, what the lessons are that we've learned from the Greek crisis. The truth of the matter, as been said before, is both of them are stuck in a currency union. So what this means is, as we learned in Greece, if you try to do a lot of budget adjustment, a lot of belt tightening, whichever way you do it, what that tends to do is it reduces aggregate demand, and you can't offset it with a cheaper currency or with your own monetary policy. So Greece tried to do massive budget adjustment. It saw its economy collapsing. The reason I'm not too optimistic on Puerto Rico, and the reason why I would share the view that this country's got a real debt sustainability problem, is that if they try to raise taxes and cut spending too quickly and raise electricity prices and do all the rest, what they'll really do is tank that economy even further, get people to emigrate to mainland, and then it's just not a viable proposition to have that debt repaid. If I could just talk briefly on the debt structure, because this really has relevance in terms of how is this all going to get resolved. If you look at the Greek debt structure, it's some 315 billion euros. I now work at 1 euro equals $1, but that might be going forward. You've got a huge amount of that, but it's basically all officially owned. So a lot of it is to the Europeans, big chunk to the ECB, chunk to the IMF. So the debt restructuring really depends on what the official creditors are going to do. And the official creditors, what they're doing is pushing out the maturities, reducing the interest rates. They're loath to write it off, but you can bring down the effect of debt to GDP ratio that way, because if you push it out to 50 years, 100 years, the maturities, and you charge them no interest, well, that's equivalent to writing the debt off, and that's the way it will go. Puerto Rico is a different kettle of fish. I thought that this chart, kind of gives you a notion that there are very many different pieces, and that you've got revenues pledged here, and you've got different claims there, and you've got a whole lot of different interests. So I wish the governor a lot of good luck in trying to restructure the debt. The question, of course, is that you don't have the bankruptcy court, so that makes it very difficult. And my take on that would be is that while you can't look at these as individual pieces, because if you do something on the electricity prices, well, that might have an impact on the other bondholders. It might make the holders of the electricity bonds happy, but it's going to be disadvantaging other bondholders, because what you'll do is you'll impact the way in which the economy works. Last point is just what I've mentioned before, is that the fallout from the debt default, the Greek case, I think that you could have very serious effects. Long term, I'm relatively optimistic. Short term, in that this time around, as opposed to 2012, Europe is in a very much better position to ring-fence Greece, to support the other countries in the periphery. You've got a European stability mechanism that's got $500 billion. More important, you've got a European Central Bank that's got a printing press and that now seems to be happy using that printing press. It's buying 60 billion euros of bonds a month. I would expect that if there is contagion of any serious means, Mr. Draghi will come up with another whatever it takes statement, and he'll back it up with action that'll stabilize it. Long term, different story, because long term, if Greece leaves the euro, we've already changed the picture of the way in which Europe works. Is that the belief that euro membership was irrevocable is no longer in play. So when Italy comes under attack, and it's got a debt to GDP of 135%, it doesn't. It's got no growth to speak of. It's got political problems. Italy, in time, will come under attack. That's going to be a lot more difficult, but that is down the road. As I've said, just to conclude, Puerto Rico, I don't want to minimize the fact that it's got $73 billion in debt. If you just put that into perspective, I understand that the Detroit bankruptcy was only something like $7 billion. So, you're talking about 10 times the size. So this might be a wake-up call to bondholders in high-yield markets that, there are risks, and that when the Fed starts raising interest rates, things might not look so pretty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Desmond. Bert.
Alex, thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here with you today to discuss a very troubling situation. If let me see, let me move to my slides. Big question is Puerto Rico America's Greece? And to this, I would say both yes and no, and I'll talk about that more as I proceed. First of all, I think it's important to, again, as others have talked about, to differentiate what their political status is. That Greece, of course, is an independent nation state, but still highly dependent financially on the EU. And also, I think it's important to also keep in mind that there is always the possibility that Greece could exit the European Union, and this, I think, increases the would be likely to happen if it abandoned the euro. So there's a real close tie there between Greece's continued use of the euro as its currency and its continuation in the EU. Looking at Puerto Rico, we have a very kind of limbo-like situation here where Puerto Rico has some broad and hard-to-break ties with the U.S. First of all, Puerto Rico residents are U.S. citizens. Puerto Rico has the dollar and, of course, enjoys substantial subsidies, not only in terms of cash flowing to Puerto Rico from the federal government, but also the tax exemptions on the debted issues that's been talked about. And then, of course, Puerto Rico citizens don't pay, generally speaking, U.S. Personal income tax. Now, the options are statehood, full independence, or maintenance of the status quo. And we've over the years, there's been a lot of debate in Puerto Rico about what their long-term status should be, but all of that, of course, is unresolved at this time. But I think, again, coming back to a point that's been made earlier, that the situations are different because of their current political status. And in Puerto Rico's difficulties are U.S. problems in a way that Greece's problems are not an EU problem, because Greece could leave the EU. Puerto Rico, it's hard to imagine it leaving the United States. So it's kind of with us, whether we like it or not. Now, in terms of the similarities and differences, first of all, neither one has a really competitive economy in a global sense, and in both cases because they're having to operate with an overvalued economy, sluggish economies, high unemployment, and burdensome regulations. Puerto Rico, of course, has been losing population, but I think that, I don't know what the population situation is in Greece, but it's hard to imagine that it's attracting many folks these days, given its problems. And of course, both are heavily subsidized in different ways by what I will call their parents, the U.S. and EU. And then again, finally, very high debt to GDP levels. And here, of course, we see a chart as to how the Greek government debt to GDP has risen up to now close to 180%, driven not only by increasing debt, but also declining GDP. And that's likely to continue to be the case in in Greece. It's interesting to note that the European Union established kind of an upper limit of debt to GDP ratio of 60%. Not that that's honored very often, but that's still a limit that was established some time ago. Greece is at 3 times that level, which gives you a sense of how far out of sync their debt to GDP ratio is relative to kind of what the EU objective is. You've seen this chart already. I apologize for the background. We have to, both Desmond and I have to attribute this to the Financial Times. It's published it about a month ago. But it's, again, it doesn't show all the interconnections. But again, it's one of the things that's interesting about Puerto Rico. For a relatively small economy, it has an incredibly complicated, convoluted debt structure, which greatly magnifies its problems. Now, in terms of differences, Greece is receiving lots of subsidies. A lot of it is kind of an ad hoc nature and politically contentious. In Puerto Rico, the subsidies are really kind of hardwired in through statute, and as I think someone said earlier, doesn't really seem to be much controversy about that, such as with all the tax exemptions that are enjoyed. Arguably, the very favorable tax break that Puerto Rico debt gets in terms of being by federal statute exempt from, on the part of the recipients of interest on Puerto Rico debt, exempt from federal, state, and local income taxes across the country. This was seen as a benefit for Puerto Rico, but arguably it actually has worked against Puerto Rico because it made it so cheap to finance their debt, relatively speaking, that it actually incentivized Puerto Rico to take on even more debt that is now a burden for it. Now, Alex asked me to talk a little bit about banking systems. One of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind in this day and age, and that is banking systems and what kind of shape the banks are in, do reflect what's going on in the economies in which they're operating. And with the Greek banks, which and we'll have a list of those in a minute, they've largely been kept afloat in recent months by the EU through what's known as the Emergency Liquidity Authority, which has basically lent a lot of money to the Greek banks to fund the huge deposit outflows that have been occurring. And but the deposit outflows, I would argue, are having longer-term negative effects on the Greek banks and therefore on the Greek economy as it tries to recover. Here's some numbers on the banks that are headquartered in Greece. All of these banks, these are for the banking group, which includes their external operations. Due to customers is essentially deposits. One of the things, if I could just point out, we see this total down in the bottom of 207 million euros. That's as of the end of last year. The funds that have been supplied under the Emergency Liquidity Authority, by my calculation, have essentially funded an outflow of about 45% to 50% of those deposits. About 93 billion euros have been advanced. And this gives you an idea of the magnitude in which confidence in Greece and in the Greek banks has been lost. I didn't put up net worth numbers for these banks. They reported positive capital positions at the end of 2014. I think as a practical matter, all these banks are insolvent, and that's going to be a longer-term challenge for Greece going forward, is having a busted banking system. Now, what's interesting about the Puerto Rico banks is that they're part of the FDIC. Those banks and their deposits are insured by the FDIC in the same way that mainland banks are. And of course, the FDIC is funded by deposit insurance premiums that all banks pay. Now, we look here at the at the banking system in Puerto Rico. It breaks into two pieces. You have 4 banks listed here that were Puerto Rican headquartered, and then we have numbers on non-Puerto Rican banks operating there, with Citibank, of course, being a major participant, Banco Santander, its parent, is Spanish, and then Scotiabank, which is a Canadian parent. You'll notice number one after Doral Bank, the footnote's missing. That bank actually, these are numbers as of the end of, as of June 30 last year. Doral Bank failed in January of this year. In fact, Puerto Rico has had a substantial number of failures, 4 of them over the last 4 years. And I want to point out that number in the lower right-hand corner, $6 billion. That is the amount of estimated loss the FDIC has taken in those failures. This is a subsidy, essentially, from U.S. banks that pay deposit insurance premiums to protect depositors in these 4 banks, a not insignificant amount of money. Now, in terms of looking at the Puerto Rican banks, in addition to having the FDIC deposit insurance protection, which is basically meant no run on the banks, the Puerto Rican banks can also borrow, if they need to, from the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. Some of the banks have borrowed heavily. And consequently, the Puerto Rican economy is not going to be held back by a weak banking system, as is the case in Greece, like in Greece. Pardon my voice. Now, in my opinion, muddling through is not an option. I think that's the approach that's been taken up to this point in time because the debt burdens have just become intolerable and are getting worse. You can only go so high, and then something has to happen. Consequently, creditors will take haircuts. The only question is when, how much, and also what the mechanism is going to be for that. And taxpayers are going to bear some losses too. Now, what are Greece's realistic options? One is to simply abandon the euro, and that might lead it to leading the EU. It's called Grexit. But if it keeps the euro, then it has to dramatically reform its economy. There's just no option other than doing that. And let me just touch a bit on, if Grexit occurs, who wins and who loses. First of all, there will be huge balance sheet gains or losses to Greek citizens and businesses, depending on what their net euro position is. Anybody in Greece who hadn't been sucking out every possible euro they could and putting it in the mattress or in a bank account in another country was rather foolish economically. And because if Greece goes off the euro, switches back to the drachma, those folks, in terms of Greek purchasing power, will enjoy a substantial gain. But now that the banks are closed, it's too late for that option. And that's why Greeks holding euros will gain if and when Greece abandons the euro. Greek debtors will gain if debt denominated in drachma in euros is redenominated in drachmas, and this is going to be a huge legal issue. And there's some very interesting parallels here with the U.S. abandoning the gold standard in 1933, and we might learn some, and the Greeks might learn some lessons from that. So, big question is, which euro-denominated debts will the Greek courts enforce or not enforce if there is Grexit? And this is an issue that, by the way, I have not really heard any discussion about, but it will become very controversial, I believe, if Greece, in fact, does drop the euro and go back to the drachma. But the big losers will be non-Greek creditors, and that, of course, will include taxpayers. Now, Puerto Rico, very different situation. First of all, I think it's much less likely that Puerto Rico will sever ties to the U.S. and abandon the U.S. dollar. Therefore, the question is, what are the options for Puerto Rico, since devaluation by abandoning the dollar is not an option? Basically, it's got to make itself much more attractive economically, and we've already heard discussion about that. I think there has to be a substantial wave of privatization. Puerto Rico is really a very socialist economy compared to the mainland U.S., and I think a key candidate for privatization is PREPA, the electric utility, which is very inefficiently operated, needs substantial capital investment. Classic situation where privatization with appropriate debt adjustments would make sense. Another thing that's interesting, and that is that Puerto Rico is stuck with U.S. minimum wage, and that is a very major negative impact on the the competitiveness of Puerto Rican labor. Unfortunately, that's an action that Congress would have to take. And just as an aside, for those of us who are not fans of the minimum wage, the Puerto Rican situation provides an excellent illustration of why high minimum wages are negative for an economy, and particularly on the least employable folks in the workforce. So finally, I think Puerto Rican debt write-downs are unavoidable. The big question is what's going to be the mechanism, and this is where the Chapter 9 bankruptcy debate comes into play. There's a lot of advocacy of saying that Puerto Rico ought to be able to do the same thing that U.S. municipalities can under Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. There are some unique aspects of that issue which raise big questions about whether or not Puerto Rico should be allowed to adjust its debt under Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. My gut sense is it's not going to happen. Puerto Rico's going to have to find out other ways in which to go through debt adjustments through negotiation with its creditors. Think Argentina. And then with that, I thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Bert. Whitney.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this comparison between Greece and Puerto Rico. I think we've heard by now pretty well what the nature of the problem is. In each case, we have a large debtor in a currency union without economic growth and with a non-competitive economy and with lots of structural impediments in that economy to growth. Large fiscal deficits and many structural issues in their public sector finances. Basically, in a currency union, you, as I once heard Sir Eddie George explain why England would never join the euro, he says, with my fiscal policy limited by Maastricht, my monetary policy set in Frankfurt, my only adjustment tool is unemployment, and that's politically unacceptable. So here we have situations where these economies confront an internal devaluation, which basically means unemployment, wage depression, and so forth. So they have to confront this situation. I think mention has also been made by adjustment by emigration, which seems to be happening in both cases. I think the previous speakers have talked about the dimensions of the problem, so I won't really tarry there. That's not my comparative advantage. But when the debt to GDP ratios get to the size that they are, something is not right. Mention has been made of the question of the composition of the debt. And the composition of the debt is, as Desmond Lockman indicated, a very key question going forward. Why is that the case? We see here a situation where we do not have a classic sort of central government debt and then one or two publicly owned agencies. We have a very complicated system of theoretical seniority created by pledges of various revenue streams. And I think that the legal question, which we may end up getting an answer to, is going to be the modern version of the question that was asked of Allen Dulles when he testified in the House of Representatives being examined by Abe Fortas in the 1930s about the Bolivian tobacco revenue bonds issued in the 1920s. And he was asked about the enforceability of the covenant pledging the tobacco revenues. And he sort of sputtered, "Oh, boilerplate, this is just all boilerplate." There is perhaps a potential difference, and this is what we will see. In the case of the Bolivian tobacco revenue bonds, there was no sheriff whom the bondholders could call upon to go and collect those tax revenues and say that they are ours. I mean, 30 or 40 years before that, it was still considered good form to send the gunboats down, and you put your man in the customs booth and he collected duties until the bonds were paid, and then you went home. But after the Hague Convention of 1907, which outlawed the use of force to collect debts, that option disappeared. Here, though, in Puerto Rico, we're within the U.S. legal system, and there is a judge, there might be a sheriff, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether these different pledges of discrete revenue streams are going to be honored, or whether there's going to be just a general equitable mush in which it's all going to be lumped together and sorted out that way. So that is one big distinction that I see with the Greek situation. It's not at all clear what happens with the composition of the Greek debt at the moment, which, as was pointed out, is largely public sector. So again, it's no longer good form to send the military to collect the debts. But if we're talking about ECB, we're talking about the EFSF, we're talking about bilateral debts, we're talking about EIB debts, who really has seniority? What about the IMF? There was one very interesting statement that was made when they started to create these mechanisms in Europe. They said, well, the IMF is senior, and then we are next. But again, who is the sheriff who says this dollar goes first to the IMF, then a dollar goes to someone else? And I know that when the private sector restructuring was done in Greece, there were many private bondholders who wrung their hands saying, well, what was the special deal that the EIB got? What was the special deal that the ECB got? For those of us who've been around EM debt restructuring, actually, that was a movie we've seen before. If you look at the way certain debts have been treated in other cases, for example, in the Brazilian Brady Plan, Brazilian banks had their own special process, and they took no haircut. They took an NPV reduction, but they took no haircut. And the logic for that, in a way, is understandable, because if you haircut the domestic banking system, then you have another hole you have to fill, and so forth. And on it goes. But anyway, this is one thing which, given the debt structure in Puerto Rico, which is going to have to play out, and we will see. I thought it would be useful to just think for a moment in a comparative basis about the policy tools that are available in the two cases. In Greece, we have ESM. Resources may be running out because the conditionality is not being met. But that's one of the interesting things. What is the conditionality or policy adjustment enforcement mechanism in Europe, and what is it going to be in Puerto Rico? At the moment, for Puerto Rico, there is none, right? There is no bankruptcy system. But one could imagine a DC control board. I mean, that was real policy adjustment enforcement. And Puerto Rico is also an Article I territory. It's governed by the Congress at the end of the day under our constitutional scheme. And there will be some back and forth about the terms and conditions of the compact between Puerto Rico and the United States, but one could imagine this type of a solution. And heaven knows, there's a big home rule movement in the District of Columbia. But when the DC Control Board was put in, even Jesse Jackson said, well, actually, this isn't going to be so bad. It might actually further the cause of statehood. So who knows in the Puerto Rican political discourse how this will play out. But that might be a possibility. In Europe, on the other hand, it's the classic no ticky, no laundry, no adjustment, no money. And that's the impasse we're in now, and which we will see playing out. In Europe, we have the Emergency Liquidity Authority that was just discussed. In Puerto Rico, we have the FDIC. There are some different mechanisms there. Theoretically, we have SRM in Europe now, the single resolution mechanism, except that in Greece, apparently it's not been put into domestic law yet. So we don't know how that's going to play out. But at the moment, it doesn't look positive. How can each country restructure if it has to restructure? In the case of Puerto Rico, as has been mentioned, there is no Chapter 9. But even if we had a Chapter 9, that might take care of a number of bubbles on this famous chart you've seen. But it's not clear to me that Chapter 9 takes care of the GO debt. It may take care of the electric company and the like, but not necessarily the GO debt. So that might lead you to think that maybe something like the control board is maybe more in line, and then a framework for private sector negotiations. But how are you going to get consent from the holders? Puerto Rico is exempt from the Trust Indenture Act, so you don't have to get a 100% vote unanimity as a matter of statute. But by contract, you may well need 100% in most cases. In Greece now, for private debts, we have collective action clauses, and they even retroactively retrofitted the domestic debt to include an aggregation feature. But we don't have that in Puerto Rico at this point. So that's going to be an interesting one. Then we have the different constitutional frameworks. Of course, in Puerto Rico, the question of sanctity of contract is there. It's in the U.S. Constitution. It's also in the Puerto Rican Constitution. But that is a provision that says no state shall pass a law impairing contract. But there is a bankruptcy power in the U.S. Constitution, and that is what is being invoked when people ask for the extension of Chapter 9. But it doesn't have to end with Chapter 9. I mean, the bankruptcy power could be more fulsome if it were deemed appropriate. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but that's a constitutional possibility. We're talking about the tools that might be available. The interesting thing in the Puerto Rico Constitution is that debt service apparently comes before salaries and pensions. This is, I think, an interesting problem. If you think about the Greek situation, at one point there were people who were saying, well, if the bondholders get haircut, we'll have a claim under the European Human Rights Convention. And so you go to Greek court for 2 years and you get denied, and then you go to a court in Luxembourg and you present your treaty claim, but it's a claim at public international law, it's not in domestic law, and in public international law there's a doctrine called the doctrine of necessity, and so then it comes down to who decides whether money is allocated for teachers, for firemen, for doctors, for debt service. And who knows how that one's going to come out. Argentina has tried that one. It hasn't worked very well. But with this Puerto Rican constitutional provision, we may have some interesting questions there. And then I think we have the question of, has anybody looked at the amendment provision in the Puerto Rican Constitution? Because it could be amended as well. At the end, I think, as I said, the basic distinction is going to come down to the fact that in Greece, they do have their own legal system. And so bonds which are governed by foreign law, other obligations governed by foreign law where there's a foreign forum may end up with one treatment, and obligations which are governed by local law may end up with another treatment. Doesn't sound terribly fair, but that comes down to the sheriff problem. And in Puerto Rico, as I said, we're all within the U.S. legal system, so we don't know with certainty how it's going to work, but there's a higher probability that some of the dedicated revenue streams which have been pledged might actually be honored as such. But if there is an overriding bankruptcy solution coming from the U.S. Congress, then that may be by the wayside, and we'll be into the usual domestic bankruptcy negotiation type situation. I think I'll stop there. I mean, we could talk about how debt to equity conversions might work and legal structures for that, but I think that's still down the road. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to all the members of the panel for excellent and extremely well-informed presentations. Now, I'd like to give all of the panelists a chance either to comment on what somebody else has said or expand on something you'd like to do. 1 to 2 minutes, 2 minutes max, and we'll just go down the row here and see what you might want to add. Dave.
One thing that struck me is it seemed like everyone had slightly different debt to economy figures. We would use gross domestic product, which is larger than gross national product. For Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico taxes those offshore manufacturers. In fact, they'd prefer to tax those offshore manufacturers to residents, and they've increased those taxes. I'm not sure if you've ever heard Monty Python's definition of a perfect tax, but that's a tax levied on all foreigners living abroad. So we would use the gross domestic product, and we would also, I think, not necessarily use the underlying municipalities. In the comparison with Greece, you're using federal debt. We wouldn't put federal debt into the Puerto Rico calculation. They don't pay federal income tax. So there's a lot of differences. I could defend what we did. The other point that I'd like to raise, I think, is that is just on the debt structure. I think it's very unclear. I agree with what's going to happen, but the fact that the Puerto Rico courts invalidated the Restructuring Act law, which was their version of Chapter 9, indicates that they're not going to be pushovers necessarily for police and fire versus debt, although I think the expectation is that debt holders, if it comes down to essential services, probably would come somewhere below.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Alex. I would agree with the last point that Dave meant. It's bondholders would come out on the short end, but that's how you get haircuts. I think in both cases, one of the things that's always hard, and it's hard as an investor too, is to put yourself in the place of the people that are in these crises day to day in the island, in Puerto Rico or in Greece. I got a note from a friend who's actually leaving for Greece on Friday. He doesn't want to give up the tickets, and he's scared. He's taking 3 kids and a wife to Greece. His wife is Greek. The mother-in-law can't get money out of the bank. The ATMs have run dry. So you're seeing crises build up. But the average Greek person, according to my friend Ed, they look at it as an attack on their culture, not an attack on their finances. It's an attack on what they have had for all along. So, for example, if you are a teacher in Greece, you get, depending on how long you've been there, you get 12 to 14 months maternity leave. And as Ed said, what happens is people have lots of kids because basically you can go 5 years, 6 years, and work only 6 months out of those and get paid the whole time through. Now, this is an extreme example, but the idea is that if you've had this a long time, it's what you're used to. In Puerto Rico, when you look at, I think a great point that was made by, I think it was Bert, was about the differences in wages. Here you have the minimum wage in the U.S. is a burden to private industry in Puerto Rico, given what they can pay. However, if you look at the vast amount of people that are employed by government in Puerto Rico, they're paid substantially higher than minimum wage. So it's really almost a two-tiered system. And it's that higher tiered system that nobody's willing to shrink. And they haven't been willing to shrink the whole way through. And when they needed to start shrinking it was absolutely in 2006 when they started losing the corporate subsidies for people there. So those are the kind of changes. You have to change the mindsets.
Thank you. Bert. I'm sorry, Desmond. It's Desmond.
No, I would just want to make one point was raised about labor mobility, making comparison between Puerto Rico and Greece. Now, while it is true that theoretically Greeks can move very freely out in the European Union, in practice, labor mobility is not so great in Europe, either for linguistic reasons or for qualification reasons or for housing reasons. So you really don't have the kind of movement that you get from the way in which we're getting from Puerto Rico to the United States. And I think that that really changes one aspect of the Puerto Rican situation, in that I don't think that this is just an issue between the Puerto Rican government and the creditors. I think that the United States is also got to play, as to whether or not we're wanting to have more people come into the mainland, whether we're wanting to have more welfare payments that we've got to make to Puerto Rico.
Now, Bert.
Thank you. When I take a look at this and listening to the remarks of others this morning, it really occurs to me that we have two fundamental problems that have to be solved. One is the debt restructuring, which has to be done in both economies. And then the other, almost tougher job is the economic restructuring of their economies going forward. If I could put this in a somewhat religious or moralistic sense, the debt restructuring and the debt that has to be restructured effectively reflects the cost of the sins of the past, the public policy sins. The economic restructuring that is needed is to prevent sins in the future. And the question is the moral strength there to not only deal realistically with the cost of the sins of the past, but also to the really, in many ways, much tougher job of trying to prevent future sinning in terms of unproductive economic policies.
Whitney?
Thank you. Well, I think that, as I mentioned at the end of my main remarks, it may be that one of the tools which can be employed, which might make a contribution in both areas, both in the adjustment area and also in terms of helping to solve the financial problem, might be the possibility of using debt equity conversions. I mean, we can think of this electric company that needs to be restructured, that it has a very high cost structure, and there's some other external policies as well which might be looked at to help that situation. But that is a time-honored way of dealing with excessive debts, and if you can take the current cost of electricity in Puerto Rico at 20 cents a kilowatt hour and bring it down to the average in the United States mainland of 10 cents a kilowatt hour, that'll be a nice boost for the economy.
Thank you. Sure. Go ahead, Dave.
One other point I'd just like to make is that for the upcoming budget for Puerto Rico, they have implemented a very significant increase in the sales tax, which I believe would have an effect on the economy. And then also to the extent, I'm not saying it would happen in the near term, but if payments to pensioners were ever cut, it would also have an effect on the economy. So they're not necessarily out of the woods yet for the economy, even though they've been kind of flatlining right now. There's other things. The 1 year since 2006 when they had a slight increase in the economy was following some tax cuts. but it also led to some huge fiscal deficits. So trying to catch their tail by closing the deficits can also have a feedback effect on the economy here, as I imagine in Greece.
Thank you. I'd like to add 3 comments myself on this before we get to questions and answers. A lot of what we've talked about makes me think of John Maynard Keynes, who was a great wit as well as thinker. He said there is an absolute limit to the extent to which any society will sacrifice itself for the bondholders. This is true. And that gets to the points John was making and others, how much sacrifice for the bondholders. Now, of course, if you have built a whole system, however, which for its very functioning depends on ever-increasing borrowing from the bondholders, when you run out of other people's money, as I said before, then that system stops. And then we get to Whitney's very important point about who's the sheriff. Of course, in good times, we don't worry about the sheriff. It's only when pushing comes to shoving that we worry about the sheriff. And then in all these cases, this is really a huge issue.
Alex, can I get
I'm going to let you talk in a minute, but I want to get my 3rd point out, which is that in historic American financial crises, when the banks would stop payment, as they called it in those days, which meant you could go to the bank, but you couldn't draw out your gold, something very interesting happened. Well, now we have the Greek banks under government orders have stopped payment. What could we expect to happen? In the historical cases, what happened is people invented money to keep functioning. So you had local merchants, for example, would issue notes redeemable in goods, or groups of merchants, or the local establishment would get together to issue their local currency, which people could use. It'd be very interesting to see if things like this maybe don't start happening, say, today in Greece to replace the state money, which has been withdrawn. Bert, one comment, and then we'll come to questions.
You made a very important point about to what extent are people going to sacrifice for the bondholders. I would say there's another important aspect of sacrifice, and that is to what extent will the people today make sacrifices for the future and for people in the future. And I think that's highly problematical too.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come to your questions. Let me remind you, I see we got a lot of them. Let me remind you how questions will work here. First, please wait for the microphone so that you will be recorded for all the posterity, speaking of the future, which will watch this on the AEI website. Tell us your name and your affiliation, and then ask your question. Because we have a lot of questions, I know many of you will wish to make statements, but I'm going to have a strict limit of 1 minute to get your question out. So I'll start here and then we'll sort of work around. Yes, sir.
Phil Suttle, Tudor Investment Corporation. One observation, Desmond's depression chart is very telling because the inflection point in that was 1933, which was when the US left the gold standard. So if Greece wants to grow again nominally, there's a very simple answer, which is leave the euro. Assuming that happens, because I think it will, my question to the panel, and I guess specifically to Whitney, but Desmond and others may want to weigh in, S&P may want to weigh in as well, is in the official sector debt restructuring, how do you see the IMF credit playing out? Specifically, aren't all the rest of the non-European IMF board directors going to go to the Europeans and say, you have to make us whole. You tricked us into this. We committed way over our heads. This is your debt. And hasn't that got to happen quite quickly?
Thank you. Somebody want to take that up? You want to start, Whitney?
Yes, well, as I pointed out with this sheriff issue and the question of seniority, there is no de jure seniority for the IMF. It's de facto. And the only way you protect that is by not overlending. And one could argue that the first package for Greece was 3 parts IMF for 8 parts Europe. But then when it moved into the second phase, DSK changed that to 1 part IMF for 2 parts Europe. And I think that the current MD thinks that that was excessive. And in the third package, it was back down around the 10% level. The question outstanding is still whether it was too much and whether they are going to suffer as a consequence. But I am assuming that even if Greece, exits, reestablishes its own currency, that it may still want to remain as a member of the IMF, and that certainly there will be ways that this will get worked out, and the true seniority of the IMF will hold. But I think implicit in your question is the possible need for others to make a contribution to make sure that happens.
If I could just add to that, I think that this may be a situation where the IMF, whether deliberately or just the way things played out, has overcommitted itself and may have really done some serious long-term damage to its autonomy that those who ultimately fund it are going to put tighter reins on it in the future as to the kinds of commitments it can make.
Great question. We'll go on to the next. Wayne, over here.
Thank you very much. Wayne Abernathy with the American Bankers Association. And not surprisingly, I have a banking question, perhaps for Mr. Lockman and Mr. Ely, or anyone else who wants to comment on it. One of the cornerstones of the Basel capital and liquidity regimes is that sovereign instruments are better than gold. Now, they think they've taken care of the Greek exception. They've sort of put that to the side. But unless we assume that Greece and perhaps Puerto Rico are anomalies, should we be concerned about these regimes that are going to increase the exposure of the global banking system to sovereign instruments, both in their capital and in their liquidity instruments?
I've never been a fan of the Basel treatment for very favorable treatment for government debt. I think that basically reflected the conflict of interest that exists because Basel essentially consists of representatives of their national governments. But hopefully, with enough of these catastrophes, that there will be some serious rethinking of the extent to which government debt, and particularly national government debt, is given a free ride, so to speak, under Basel. And this may be the situation that leads to that fundamental rethinking.
Yeah, this was supposed to be a problem that was going to be dealt with in around about 2012, but that certainly hasn't been the case. That what you've seen is a lot of the countries in the European periphery, be it the Italians, be it the Spanish, getting their banks to buy the sovereign bonds. So we do have a massive problem of the interlink between the sovereign and the banking system. I'm also rather surprised, that the ECB has been extending quite as much money as they have to the Greek banks. That the amount that they've got outstanding is around about 110 billion, and a lot of that collateral is Greek sovereign bonds, which I'm not quite sure how solid a collateral that is.
Desmond, as you and I have discussed before, if you're a government, one of the main purposes of having a banking system, and especially a central bank, is so they'll buy your debt. Yes, right here, please. Then I'll get to you. Right here. Whoop. Well, that's all right. Go ahead. Go ahead, and then we'll come to you, sir, and then up in the front here. Yeah, go ahead.
Jim Radler, the Voice of America. Two quick questions for Bert. As succinctly as possible, what is the most likely way forward for Greece? What is the most likely way forward for Puerto Rico?
My belief is that Greece will have to exit the euro. I just don't see how they can stay with it, given all the structural problems in their economy. And then if they do, the EU may kick Greece out. That may be the tougher issue for the EU to address with. I think with regard to Puerto Rico, it's kind of stuck for better or worse, within the structure of the United States. And so it's going to have to, number one, see some significant debt restructuring. As we've seen in that great Financial Times chart, it's going to be a very complicated, multifaceted process. And then they're going to have to go through, with the cooperation of the United States Congress, to make very significant structural reforms. And I think, again, one of the key problems they've got down there is the minimum wage that they're subject to.
And Desmond has a comment. And then, John, I'm going to call on you as somebody who actually buys bonds to make these double prediction as well.
Just quickly on Greece, just from a legal point of view, the ruling of the ECB, who've taken a look at the Treaty of Lisbon, is that a country can't get kicked out of the euro. The country can choose to leave the euro but can't get kicked out. Now, on that point, the problem that Mr. Tsipras has is that 80% of the Greek population wants to hold the euro right now. So the chance of his going directly to the drachma would seem to be limited. What would occur, though, is what Alex referred to, is that the Greek government will soon be running out of money. So what they'll be doing is they'll be paying people, whether they're pensioners or wage earners or corporations, they'll be paying them with IOUs. So we'll go to a phase where we'll have two currencies effectively circulating in Greece, one the euro, the other the IOU, and that might be a transition way down the road, for Greece to be exiting.
John, predictions.
Let me just add one thing to what Desmond said, is that here in the United States, Illinois has already been doing that for the last few years. They've been paying their vendors in IOUs. And it used to be that you could actually go to a bank and get a discount on the IOU and get paid. The banks won't take the IOUs. So you have to take the IOUs and get paid a year later. And they do them in order, and there's a pecking order to it. So I agree. As someone who buys bonds and manages bonds and manages risk, you always say, are you getting paid, for the risk? I would say in the insured debt, as we are very sure that we're getting paid, we're getting significantly paid well for a 5.5% to 6% tax-free yield, which is a 10% taxable equivalent, where you have the resources to be paid back. The answer is yes. On the uninsured debt, no. What's also interesting, though, is that, and you made the point, is that the capital markets, in the end, are your friend, and you can't disregard them to the point where you don't have future access to capital down the road. An interesting side point to this is if you actually went back and we saw some pictures of the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, in this country, you actually had about 1,700 municipal entities go bankrupt. And that actually included the state of Arkansas, which itself made payments to its localities and towns so they wouldn't go bankrupt. So the state took the hit. The good part about this is that almost all of them, except for maybe a few Dust Bowl towns in Oklahoma, which literally blew away, all the other municipal entities in the United States ended up repaying all of their debt in full down the road after they made changes and the economy got better. So it tells you that, the restructurings that'll go on now don't mean permanent removal from the capital markets, and it doesn't mean in the long run you're not paid back.
Thank you. Come right here. Gentleman here. Thank you.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent, Europolitics. And there may be a very simple answer to this, but I've always wondered why a country like Japan can have, for years and years, 240% debt to GDP ratio and rising, and nobody ever asks the question why, if Japan will go into default. And of course 180% is a huge figure, but it's still a lot less than 240%, and Puerto Rico's 80% is a lot less than 240%.
Desmond, I think that's right up your alley.
Yeah, well, it's something that does keep me up at night, kind of like wondering, because this doesn't make much sense, and I think that I'd be concerned about Japan partly for demographic reasons. If you look at Japan's demographics, you're getting the aging of the population. So Japan used to have very high saving rates domestically. They had a lot of repression in their banking system. Institutions would be forced to buy the Japanese bonds. That party went on. They're not very dependent on foreign bondholders. They've only got something like 10% of their bonds are owned by foreigners. Going forward, the concern is that as the population ages, they're going to be drawing down on their savings, and they're going to become more dependent on foreigners. And this is a party that really can't go on indefinitely. But when I worked on Solomon Brothers, I was told that there was a plaque on the walls saying how many traders had lost their jobs by being short the Japanese bond market. So it's not a good idea to short that market yet.
Thank you. I have a... Oh, yes, go ahead.
Just wanted to add one thing. A great point is that there were lots of hedge funds that shorted the Japanese government 10-year bond at 2%, saying this is incredibly low level, and those hedge funds are all in Potter's Field. The other part was that last year Japan sold more adult diapers than diapers, and I think that tells you all you need to know about the demographics.
We still have a question up here. You've been waiting. Yeah, wait for the microphone, please.
Part question, part statement very quickly. I agree with David that obviously Puerto Rico has a high probability of a default event. But I still haven't heard anything from the panel about why they need to default or restructure. I think we have a dramatic shift from willingness to pay, from ability to pay being the focus to willingness in Puerto Rico. The facts are not any country in my memory, and I've been involved in a lot of these, has ever restructured with a debt GDP ratio below 40%, with an average maturity of its debt of 25 years, with an average interest rate on its debt of 5%, with a current consolidated fiscal deficit below 1.5%, below 1% is projected for this year. It's a willingness to pay, and there's a group of creditors, perhaps including the insurance companies, which are willing to put about $3 billion in as bridge financing. Now, what we also observe is countries which adjust gain market access. Thank you.
Now you had your minute there. I'm going to take that question as anybody have comments on willingness to pay. Maybe, Whitney, that one is for you.
Well, I'm not the economist here on the panel, but I think that
that's why you get the question.
Yeah, right. No, I mean I may be one of the few people in this room who's actually represented a sovereign at a time when they declared a moratorium, just outright declared it, and of course 6 weeks later they thought better of it. But I think that the question of adjustment in these economies is really paramount because that really has to do with the ability to pay. And there have been some references here to, cultural limits and things like that. But in some societies, they pass the hat and people put in their personal gold so that the country can pay its debts. And we don't see that happening in either one of these two cases. So there is that dimension. I think one of the reasons, just to supplement my earlier response about the IMF and its seniority, is that the IMF, in a sense, is in part the useful enforcer, and so it will have a utility, and it, along with its enforcer role, also has some DIP financing role, and so people will find a way to do that. So I think what we need in each case is a mechanism which helps the borrowers see how they can make the way forward. I mean, we've talked about scrip. When I was in government, California came to the Treasury, knocked on the door, asked for help, and they were told to go home and think about it some more, and they managed to adjust. They did raise taxes. I mean, I know that well as a partner in a law firm with operations in California. The marginal rate is quite high, and it's not necessarily growth inducing. I think the difference, though, is that California had a basic underlying economy with a lot of power and a lot of potential. The question for these two economies is that really they are economically so inefficient. How can we help them make that adjustment?
Thank you. I have Desmond and Burt, but these have to be very short additions.
Right. Key thing about Puerto Rico particularly is they got lots of different bond structures and entities. Some of those are revenue bonds. If we take a look at the electric utility specifically, it is independently financed. It has very serious financial problems. Its debt is certainly a prime candidate for restructuring. I can't imagine that PREPA is going to get bailed out by the Puerto Rican government.
I would just repeat what I said before, is that there could be a question of ability to pay. It depends on how much of a fiscal adjustment does the country need to do in a currency union. And the lesson that we have learned from Greece is that requiring a country to do a major fiscal adjustment within a currency union generally is not a good idea, because you're just going to tank the economy further. And just with the chart that I put up, this is an economy that's got structural problems already, that's declining. All that you're going to do is you're just going to accelerate its downward death spiral.
Can I just say?
Yep.
I mean, rating
Short, though.
looks at both ability and willingness, but in terms of ability, in the short run, they're in a liquidity crisis right now. So that's your answer. But that's partly brought upon by the willingness to make adjustments to bring in external investors. So there's elements of both.
I saw a hand way in the back here, Jim.
Jim Glassman from AEI. So Greece is a sovereign country. Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. How much culpability does the White House and Congress have over in the Puerto Rican situation? I mean, some of us have been, this is not a big surprise. Some of us have been writing about this for the last year and a half and testifying in Congress, and yet there really has been no response at all from the administration or from Congress.
Okay, how guilty is the U.S. government for Puerto Rico's problems, John?
I would think very guilty in terms of non-action over the last 5 or 6 years, when it's become pretty clear that they needed help. And there's this, really since 2008, Lehman, they got over, and AIG, there was this no bailout mentality in Congress. Except in this case, it's their responsibility. And so, in my opinion, it's been a total abdication of responsibility. And that isn't necessarily bailout. That's getting involved in a territory that reports to you. So it has nothing to do with Detroit. It has nothing to do with Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because they have states overseeing it. This is Congress's problem, and it's high time they got involved.
This is just typical of how Congress operates. I'll draw an analogy with the S&L crisis back in the 80s. That crisis was emerging through the 80s, but it wasn't until we had a change in administration in 1989, and the S&L industry's back was really to the wall, much more so than Puerto Rico, that Congress finally acted. So I certainly cannot expect us to, or we should not expect Congress to act in a timely manner. They don't act until there's an actual crisis staring us in the face. Puerto Rico's not there yet.
And I just wanted to state that our rating does not assume any extraordinary federal support. Neither do we anticipate it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I haven't had one from this side here. Anybody? Oh, okay. Yes, last question here.
Gerald Chandler, you talked about past sins and future sins. What's the difference between Puerto Rico and Hawaii? Why was Hawaii seemingly successful and Puerto Rico not?
Well, of course, I think it's a very different culture between the two entities. And the other thing to keep in mind is, number one, Hawaii's been able to maintain a strong support from the U.S. military. Puerto Rico, a lot of the military presence there was cut back. But the other thing, of course, is Hawaii is a state, and Puerto Rico is in this kind of limbo land, and I think that is a factor also.
All right, we could talk about this a long time, and I expect we will some more, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming, and let's show our appreciation for an outstanding panel.